Greetings, everybody. I think folks are starting to join, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks to everyone for joining us today. Very happy to be having today's session on managing travel demand through development rules. Once again, thanks for joining us. My name is Chris McCahill. I'm the Managing Director of the State Smart Transportation Initiative. And I'll be leading today's discussion with our guests. For those of you who are new to SSTI, just give you a little intro here. We are mainly a network for reform-oriented state DOTs, and we're jointly operated by the University of Wisconsin and Smart Growth America. We operate mainly in three ways. The first is by providing a community of practice for the leaders of state DOTs to come together, share their challenges and best practices with each other. The second is as a source of technical assistance for state and local transportation agencies. And a lot of the work you're going to be hearing about today was the result of some of our technical assistance with folks. And lastly is that we provide knowledge sharing for all of you through events like today's webinar and through our blog and newsletter, which you can sign up for if you want to head over to our website at ssti.us and stay in the loop on the latest research and best practices from transportation agencies across the country. Today's webinar is going to focus mainly on work that we've done with the cities of Los Angeles and Madison to help them incorporate transportation demand management principles into their development review process. We are happy to be joined today by folks from both cities, Xander Wickstrom with Transportation Planning Associate with the City of Los Angeles, and Philip Gritzmacher, Transportation Planner at the City of Madison, here where SSTI is headquartered. Before we get into the presentation today, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge some of our supporters who funded this work throughout the years, including Transit Center and the JPP Foundation. And remind folks that today's webinar is eligible for 1 AICP credit, and you should be able to access that through the link that was dropped in the chat. While you're over there at the chat, you'll notice that is turned off for attendees, but we do encourage folks to ask questions throughout the presentations using the Q&A feature. So once again, the chat is disabled, but please share your questions through the Q&A. With that, I will get started with a little bit of background for today. I know some folks may be wondering, for a group that works mainly with state DOTs, why are we so interested in city policy today? So for that, I will give a little background. The reason for talking about this subject today is that we're currently operating in a supply-centered system. And what that means is we've got, the way this typically plays out is developers will find a nice piece of land, often near a highway interchange or a freeway access point, develop that land with offices or shopping center, and then the local government will typically tell them that they need to build a certain amount of parking in order to handle the anticipated demand, usually at the busiest time of the year. So then they build that parking. It's often more parking than they would typically need. And that creates a bunch of traffic. That traffic eventually backs up onto the roads, and then it's up to the state or local DOT to add capacity to the road to handle all that traffic. And the cycle repeats and repeats. And so we find ourselves through local land use and transportation policy constantly trying to chase demand with more and more supply. I think many of us here know where that has led us. So this traditionally has facilitated growth patterns that look a lot more like the image on the lower left here, which is very spread out development, very car-oriented transportation systems. And this comes with, basically necessitating people to drive a lot more. And this comes with a bunch of problems, associated traffic increases, pollution, higher transportation costs, both for individuals and for local governments, and a bunch of equity issues. As opposed to what many of us know, the pattern that you see in the top right, which is more compact development patterns with multimodal transportation options, tends to give people more options and in many ways is much more efficient. Now, if anyone's been following our recent webinars, you may know that we've been working pretty closely with a handful of state DOTs as they work through questions like what they can do at the state level to support development patterns that look more like the image on the top right here. And as you work through that process, you learn that there are things that the state DOT can do in the way that they build roads and deliver other transportation projects. But it becomes clear that they also need to lean on locals to help manage demand at the local level through development and land use regulations. And that's what brings us to our discussion today. So a lot of local governments are recognizing this need for land use policy reform. Often this takes the form of parking reform. So here's a map from the Parking Reform Network that shows cities that have adopted some sort of parking reform over the years, obviously in cities and regions all across the country. This reform often takes the shape of getting rid of parking requirements. Many people might know Buffalo, one of the first cities to just sort of eliminate its minimum parking requirements citywide. Other cities like Hartford, San Francisco, and others followed suit just a few years later. So we start to see this happening a lot of places, and this has a lot of benefits where it's been implemented in that it lets developers decide how much parking is appropriate for their site, which for anybody who knows anything about financing of development projects, there's a good chance that they're going to be sure to provide enough parking to ensure the viability of a project. But it also gives them some flexibility to get more creative about how they provide parking. For example, through shared parking or through just leasing existing parking and just sort of handling their parking demands in creative ways appropriate for the site. So this is sort of the quick and dirty approach to parking reform. But what we're actually going to talk a little bit more about today is a bit of a more nuanced approach. And this is implementing transportation demand management in lieu of parking requirements, or often alongside parking requirements. For anybody who's interested in learning more about the concepts that you'll be hearing today, we released a guide called Modernizing Mitigation just a few years ago. And this guide actually grew out of some of the work we were doing with Los Angeles early in the development of their program. And then it helped inform our work later with the city of Madison, who in some ways has taken the concepts a step further, as you'll hear soon. But what this is in a nutshell is when a developer comes in, instead of the traditional approach of just saying to that developer, we need you to provide this much parking in order to accommodate all the demand. We might need you to make some investments in nearby road capacity or intersection improvements in order to handle all that traffic. What we're going to do instead is ask developers to take any number of steps to make sure that they're not creating as much traffic. That could start with simply by having developers locate in more central locations where we know that there are going to be more transportation options, and it will be that much easier not to create as much travel demand. Or it could be through implementing any number of TDM measures like you see here from San Francisco's program, which is one that we learned a lot from as we were going through our process with Los Angeles and Madison. These measures could include everything from at the top of the list here, active transportation investments. So investing in walking and biking accommodations, down to the bottom of the list, some measures focused specifically on parking. So unbundling parking from leases for building space, charging for parking directly, or letting employees cash out their parking spot if they don't need it. and also just simply cutting down on the supply of parking. And then a bunch of different types of measures in between. All these things we know to varying degrees help cut down travel demand at the development level. So I don't want to go too much more into this because you're going to hear much more about it from our speakers today. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to our first speaker. So I will hand things over to our first guest, Xander Wickstrom with the City of Los Angeles.
Thank you. So I'm going to actually have Jonathan Ayon, my colleague in city planning, begin our presentation. So here, is everything visible on my screen here?
Yep, looks good.
All right. Well, Jonathan, you take it away.
All right, thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Jonathan Ayon. I'm with the Department of LA City Planning. I'm here with my colleague, Xander Wickstrom. Today, we're going to present the proposed updates to our Transportation Demand Management Ordinance, which has been a collaborative effort between our two departments. Today, I'll cover some of the background and how and why we're doing this update. And then I'll hand it over to Xander to dive deeper into the program details, provide some next steps for us, and hopefully have some time for a Q&A. So starting off with some background, a little bit of context for this, for you that you're not familiar with LA. Our city is very diverse in many ways. It has very dense and non-dense areas, covers around 470 square miles, and it's made up of 35 community plans, which can be envisioned as 35 small cities. We have close to 4 million residents, about 1.5 housing units, and continue to be the largest employment hub in our region, hosting over 2 million employees. So what is Transportation Demand Management, or TDM? So this really refers to the strategies a city uses to influence travel behavior and accommodate growing demands on the transportation system. In LA, the main goal is to reduce drive-alone trips and increase sustainable transportation options, which benefits the environment, public health, and can ease traffic congestion. The proposed TDM program update will require new development and substantial additions of certain size to implement strategies such as supporting transit, telecommuting, car share, neighborhood shuttles, and other strategies that help reduce vehicle trips. Next slide. So LA's current TDM ordinance was adopted in 1993, and it was built on several decades of growing awareness about the needs to address how land development patterns contribute to air pollution. The current ordinance focuses on reducing commuting trips and congestion and applies to large non-residential projects. But since then, transportation options have changed. Most of our metros, our local transit agencies' rail system has been built out and continues to be built out. And now we have bike share, car share, scooters, and applications with real-time transit information. Also, environmental and health goals have become more paramount, not just for our city, but for our state, and been elevated by changes in state law. So for instance, in 2013, Senate Bill 743 shifted how cities analyze transportation, going from a focus on traffic delay, also known as level of service or LOS, to a measurement metric called vehicle miles traveled or VMT, which instead focuses on the distance people travel in cars. Fewer vehicle miles traveled leads to improved air quality and public health outcomes, and ultimately a more sustainable region. This represented a statewide effort to reduce emissions and vehicle travel. So in 2016, we began to do the technical work to transition to VMT, and at the same time began to work on updating our TDM program. So city staff convened a technical advisory committee and outside experts to help guide us through the early development of that program. So now we're talking about some of the objectives behind this program update and why we're doing this. So we know that this is very outdated ordinance, and now there are new priorities for our city, for the state, and new opportunities. So the proposed update looks to modernize transportation, advancing sustainability in our city, and address climate change goals that influence travel behavior by incentivizing sustainable modes of travel. So this update complements the transition to VMT and focuses on reviewing the impacts that really matter, prioritizing people over cars. So this update will apply more widely to more projects than today's ordinance, and also provide the opportunity for the city to strengthen it and improve how we mitigate transportation impacts, allowing developers to tap into these new opportunities and provide these benefits to their communities. So some of the objectives behind the update, again, is to reduce drive-alone trips, reduce VMT, and leveraging these new technologies and incentivizing sustainable modes of transportation. Through this update, in LA, we'll have a greater array of incentives in place and alternatives for vehicle travel. And by reducing VMT, we are hoping to promote active transportation and propose changes that can also provide public benefits, which kind of lead us to the next slide, the desired outcomes. So some of those desired benefits include improved health, improved air quality, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but really overall improving quality of life for all Angelinos and providing more options, more choices so people can get around the city in sustainable ways. All while also improving the current process by creating a process that is simple, flexible, and is streamlined for projects to tap into this TDM program. And then also providing assistance of online support tools like the TDM calculator, which Sandra will expand more in the following slides. So city staff knows that travel patterns have changed dramatically in response to the pandemic. Our Department of Transportation actively collects data that show a rise in people telecommuting and a decline in people driving and using transit. However, these trends are not distributed equally, and we see higher income workers able to take advantage of working remotely, while essential workers tend to live in lower income households and continue to rely on transit to get to work. So there is much uncertainty about how these trends will persist after the pandemic. While the data has showed a sharp drop in vehicle trips immediately after the Safer at Home order, the number of car trips has been steadily increasing since, and it's unknown whether people will adopt their old travel habits as soon as it is safe. So through this update, we're hoping to nudge development and provide so it could become more sustainable and continue supporting telecommuting arrangements through this update and providing more mobility options that are accessible to everyone regardless of their occupation. That means offering meaningful incentives and infrastructure improvements that support pedestrian safety and commuters returning to transit and other shared modes of travel, as well as incentivizing those who are trying new ways of traveling for the first time. So here I'll hand it over to my colleague Sandra to do a deeper dive into the program details.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. Let me just get my mouse out of the way. Thanks everyone for having us, and thanks Jonathan for giving a great introduction to how this program works. So this is a little bit more about the program details of how everything will work under the TDM update. So the TDM program's update has three main components. There's the ordinance update, which will amend the existing section of code in the zoning code as it exists today, which will establish a legal framework, applicability, and enforcement mechanisms of the program. Separately, we'll have a program guidelines document that will contain details about program administration and TDM strategies. This is meant to be a more flexible and easily alterable document as more strategies become known and more research gets known about the impact of certain TDM strategies. And finally, I'll also touch on the TDM calculator that Jonathan mentioned that is made in collaboration with the nonprofit organization Hack for LA. It's an online tool that makes it really simple for project applicants to put in information about their project and to understand TDM requirements. So what will the TDM update look like? So under the current TDM ordinance, it only applies to a limited range of projects, larger office buildings mostly. This update will make TDM applicable to non-residential and residential projects that exceed a certain minimum size threshold. So where applicable, these projects will be required to incorporate strategies that reduce vehicle trips. Although it will apply to many more projects than it does currently, the updated TDM program is intended to be flexible so that the TDM strategies that an applicant may pick will be tailor-made, perfect size and perfect strategy for their for their certain contexts in their neighborhoods. Compliance with the TDM program is going to be a ministerial process, which would not require a public hearing or entitlement from city planning. A bit more about the program structure. We first have the menu of strategies, more than 40 strategies that a project applicant can select from to achieve a point target, and each strategy has its own point value. For example, installing a publicly accessible bike share station on the property would be worth 5 points. And those point targets are dependent on the project scale and the parking it provides. a range between 15 and 35 points. I'll go into detail about how that works a little bit later. And then the project selects the strategies from the TDM strategy list that will help them achieve that point target. A little similar to the San Francisco guide that was shown a little earlier. And then the feedback loop is talking about how monitoring and evaluation, we have revamped those so that there's stronger compliance standards for projects so that we can learn more about the effectiveness of certain programs and strategies, again, to make the TDM program stronger in the future and flexible as more strategies become available. Here's a comparison of what used to be covered under the TDM ordinance and the proposed one, the certain thresholds. It used to just be all new non-residential development or additions, 25,000 square feet or more. Now it can be residential projects of 25 units or more, and some more uses are detailed under our thresholds. The strategies, there used to only be 6 of them, and you would have to comply with them based on your project size. It was basically selected for you. Now applicants can select from more than 40 strategies so that it's tailor-made to best benefit the project and the people who will be living or working in it. Previously, the TDM plan would just be attached to the covenant. That's still the case in the proposed TDM update, but now we will have annual reporting of how those, that could be like take form of a receipt from a contractor if you're contracting out your HOV program, or photographs of your bike parking, et cetera, et cetera. And we also have, for larger projects, outcome-based targets, which is no stranger for existing larger projects in the city of LA. And we also have penalty fees for non-compliance with the ordinance. Here's some of the information about those project thresholds mentioned earlier. Level 1 projects are going to be the smallest projects that qualify, that have obligations under TDM. Those are smaller and therefore they will have less to do under TDM. And level 3 projects will be the largest ones. And the main difference to know about level 3 and the other 2 levels is that level 3 has monitoring, data monitoring that they have to collect to help us evaluate program effectiveness, as well as to fulfill other obligations under air quality rules. Just one other point of note on this slide is that 100% affordable housing will only be under level 1 and only if it is 50 or more units, which also is part of existing city policies known as site plan review. A little bit more about the point target system. So level 1 projects will have to comply with 15 points, but there could be more. And then level 3 starts at 25 points. The types of land uses you select for your project are going to be what drives what level you fall under. Level 1, 2, or 3. And then as you input your parking, that may add points to your point target range. For example, if you go over the minimum parking required under the law currently, you will be required to do more. This is due to the fact that research has demonstrated over and over again, as mentioned earlier, that more free parking provided to people who live or work in a certain building means that they will drive more often for all sorts of trips. And it will usually be single occupancy vehicle trips. So therefore, those projects that elect to provide more parking will have to provide also more sustainable transportation options. Here's a little slide of the TDM calculator in its current iteration. Again, we're still fine-tuning everything, so these are still subject to change. This is an example project that I just made up, which has 50 dwelling units and 40,000 square feet of office. And the threshold that it is at means that it is at project level 2. That means it currently has 20 points, but if it includes more than the code required parking, it could need to reach a point target of up to 30 points. And here is the next page where a project applicant would input the parking. I made up an amount of parking and it happened to exceed the citywide parking baseline. Therefore, I will have to make this project have a TDM plan that equals 22 points in its point target. This is a slide that has examples of programmatic strategies versus the physical strategies, just a broad categorization. There's more strategies than what's listed here, but programmatic strategies that include subsidizing transit passes, parking cash out, pricing or unbundling parking. And then there's the physical strategies, which have to do with the design of the building, whether that's installing a bike share station somewhere on the property, reducing the parking supply, etc. And on the next slide, on the next page, after you submit your parking number, you will be able to select on the menu of strategies. Now, this project has selected menu of strategies that you can see on the left side of the screen underneath the point target. It's achieved its point target, so therefore it's a compliant TDM plan. Upon creating a compliant TDM plan, it can go to the Department of Transportation for review. It's a ministerial process. It'll happen pretty quickly, and this will be part of your covenant and agreement in the future. And again, this can be alterable. You can save projects. It's a really great tool that we worked with HAF4LA. So the big picture on compliance and monitoring is that we are requiring more projects that qualify under TDM to do more monitoring, including annual compliance documentation at all levels, and to have the site TDM plan available at all times. But the level 3 is where the monitoring compliance is going to be a bit stricter. That means that they have performance targets that measure how many people are arriving alone by car versus using sustainable modes of transportation. But these are also projects that typically already comply with regional air quality standards. So they usually have to do some amount of monitoring already. This is just making that also available to city departments and and adds some more compliance monitoring that they have to do. This is all to help the program revamp and improve itself as needed. Briefly, I'm going to talk about where we're at in our next steps. Right now, we're in a public outreach phase. We have a public hearing that is going to be scheduled very shortly for the summertime, early summertime, and we're still refining our draft documents in accordance with the feedback that we've been getting from our stakeholders. Later, we're going to be continuing the adoption process in the city's system. So once the law is in its final state, it will be voted on before Planning Commission for support, the council committees and city council. And then finally, in the effective date, which we are anticipating at the end of this year, that will begin the program phase in. So after the mayor's signature, 6 months after the effective date, level 2 and 3 projects will begin to have to comply with the revamped TDM ordinance. And then 1 year after phase in is when level 1 projects will have to comply. That concludes this presentation. Thank you so much for listening. We would be happy to take some questions. I don't know if you want to do Q&A after, but again, my name is Xander Wickstrom, and you listen to me and Jonathan Ione. Furthermore, my colleagues from City Planning, Emily Gable and Cameron Phillips, are in the audience right now, and so they can help us answer Q&A questions too. So we may have to promote them to speak. I'm not sure if we'll just unmute them, but raise your hands if Emily and Cameron, if you have anything else to say. But thank you so much. Feel free to send emails to planning.mobility@lacity.org or ladot.tdm@lacity.org. Thanks again.
Great. Thanks, John and Xander. Of course, you can drop your questions in the Q&A at any time. We don't have any coming in yet, so I take it to mean that there's no urgent clarifying questions, but we will take those at the end. And so now I will hand things over to our next speaker, Philip Gritzmacher, Transportation Planner with the City of Madison. Philip, take it away.
Thank you, Chris. Just 1 second while I get this shared. Can everybody see this?
Yep, looks good.
Great. My name is Philip Gritzmacher. I'm a planner with the City of Madison Department of Transportation, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. Normally, I go through what transportation demand management is, but we've gone through that a number of times today. It's a series of policies and strategies, and our main goal there is to reduce the number of people driving to where they're driving in a single occupant vehicle. And this is so important to us because of a few things. First of all, VMT is outpacing population growth nationally and in Madison, and that's just not sustainable. And when we take a look at what effect that has on our physical infrastructure, this is a picture of East Washington Avenue, right through the center of the Isthmus, one of the densest areas in our community at rush hour. And what you see here is that we are completely backed up with traffic and we have no room to grow. So in light of that, we need to look at other methods of transportation to get people around. This ends up being a pretty significant barrier for anyone who wants to bike, walk, or take transit. And TDM can be a way to resolve that. We are also dealing with a climate crisis. And I think that we're all aware of this at this point. If we keep doing what we're doing, we have problems. And if we don't cut back, we're going to see some really extreme results of the CO2 growth. We're seeing some of those results right now of the emissions that we have. So this is a map right here that shows the increase in rainfall in the last 30 years compared to that of the 20th century. And what you'd see generally is out west, it's getting drier, and out east and in the Midwest, it's getting wetter. And right here in Madison, where that arrow's pointing, we are receiving on average 4 extra inches of precipitation annually. And this isn't coming evenly. What we're seeing is that we're having events like this in 2018, where we saw flooding all around our community, and it caused tens of millions of dollars worth of damage. This is our future if we don't try to address this. And we're only one community, but we all need to chip in and do our part to try to resolve this problem. And TDM really helps with that. One of the reasons why it helps is we know that these are the 4 sectors that contribute the most to greenhouse gas emissions, and transportation is at the very top of that. And that's something that the city, especially the Department of Transportation, can work on. And really that comes to how we facilitate our development. So Chris talked about this a little bit previously. We get a new development, we would expand our networks to facilitate the trips that development generates. What we want to do with TDM is take the number of trips that new development is creating, that single occupant vehicle trips, and fit them into our existing network. We don't want to expand that anymore. We want to get people into other modes of transportation. So we've been working towards implementing our TDM program and ordinance now for since 2020. And so we started out in May, establishing our goals and draft purpose statement. And we've been kind of snaking through this process, as you see. So we started with literature reviews and studies of peer cities. We developed our own strategies with the help of SSTI, and came up with a draft program. We had focus groups with this structure that we put together, and we took it to our boards and commissions. So that's our Transportation Policy and Planning Board and our Plan Commission. Based on the public engagement and our commission feedback that we received, we refined our measures and developed some new measures in a draft TDM program materials. We then took those materials to developers and the community for feedback. And we received a lot of really valuable feedback from the development community and from the public. And we used that to refine and our draft program. And we're currently working towards getting this program adopted. I was hoping that it would be done by right now, but that's not ever how things work. So we're still working on that, and I'll get into that near the end and tell you some of the things that have led to this being a little bit more delayed than we had hoped. So why are we doing this? Well, it's in our city policies. This is a community value. You can find it in our comprehensive plan, Imagine Madison. It's one of the strategies that we have to reduce VMT. It's in our transportation plan, Madison in Motion. It's in our sustainable vision, which the mayor released last year, about a year ago, to try to reduce or to require new developments to incorporate features that help future residents and workers get around without a car. And it's also in our ordinances, in our land use policy. All the way across the board, we're talking about TDM. We're talking about transportation management associations and the requirements that we have for forming these. But we have issues right now. We've been requiring some sort of TDM for 20 years, and the application of TDM has been uneven. And that's because we don't really have a process for this. And that's where what we're doing right now comes into play. Developers aren't really sure right now what TDM measures are required. The commissions and councils aren't sure if the TDM that's being presented from the developers is good enough. And this leads to a prolonged process. And it creates an environment of uncertainty for developers and policymakers, and it leads to a really drawn out process. So I wanted to present a really high quality development that was presented to us back in 2020, and the process for getting TDM approved for that particular process or project. So this is a redevelopment of our old former state DOT site. It's called Madison Yards. It will be flanked by BRT in the future. They proposed that it would have a bike share right in the center of this. It's a mixed use development with a grocery store, office space. It's next to an office space. It's a fairly dense location with some amenities that are walkable to it. And it took 7 meetings to get TDM required, one of which took over an hour. And the main reason for that is throughout the entire process, the developer was unsure if what they were proposing was sufficient. So they were kind of throwing things at the wall, and the commissions weren't sure if what was being presented to them was good enough. So this program is aiming to eliminate that uncertainty and create a streamlined process. Because ultimately what we really want to do, like I mentioned, is get people out of their cars and get them into other modes of transportation. We have roughly 2/3 of our people in Madison that are currently driving to work alone. And we think we can do better than that, even though we know that's pretty good for a city of our size nationally. So we're looking at this thinking that this is a way that we can mitigate VMT. This is a way that we can support equitable transportation. It's a way that we can reduce congestion and emissions. We can support better development patterns that are denser and more sustainable, and address some of the safety impacts that since COVID has begun has really been kind of at the forefront of everyone's mind. So to begin the process, we didn't want to reinvent the wheel, so we looked at a number of TDM programs, including Los Angeles, and we wanted to grab the best ideas out of all the programs that were out there. So we zeroed in on a couple of them. St. Paul had a pretty strong focus on parking, and Denver and San Francisco's programs made it very easy to figure out what your point requirement was going to be for TDM mitigation measures, and provided a very clear pathway to get there. San Francisco had a website similar to the one that LA is developing to demonstrate your compliance and to pick your measures, and Denver had a spreadsheet. And both of those we thought were very good, so we wanted to use those as models. And the processes were very good as well. So with that, we developed our process. So first of all, we determine the applicability of TDM to a particular project. We determine the TDM requirements if it is applicable to a project. Then we require that they create a TDM plan, and then we have them implement the measures, report out, and recertify the plans annually. So to figure out whether TDM is applicable to a project, there's a few things that we're looking at. First of all, land use, that's very important. Depending on the type of land use, different numbers of trips might be generated. The development size is the exact same way. The bigger the development, the higher the potential to generate trips. But then there's also proposed parking, and this has been mentioned throughout the presentation today, that providing free parking generates SOV trips. It encourages people to drive to work or to drive from their home to their work. So the higher the parking ratio, the more TDM requirements that we're going to levy. And then the location, we want to encourage development in locations where it is efficient to take other modes of transportation. So we're trying to incentivize that as well. And the TDM requirements change depending on the location of the project. So we identified a number of measures, and we assigned values for these measures on a range of 1 to 10. So the values of these measures depend on a few things: the efficiency of the efficacy of the measure at reducing vehicle travel, documented best practices, cost of implementing the measure, and then the contextual relevance for Madison. And then we also included a number of modifiers so that we're not incentivizing developers to pick measures that are inappropriate for the project. So we want to modify things such as transit values, car share values, and bike share values for points based on whether or not those options are actually available to those developments. And we also want to consider the location of the development. So this is a map of Madison. And one of the things that came out of our conversations with the developers was that it didn't quite seem fair that we were requiring the same amount of TDM regardless of the location in the community, and we could push development out into suburban communities. So we came up with a process to actually reduce point values as you get further out into the periphery, understanding that the further you are from the city's core, the less opportunities you have for certain types of mitigation measures. And part of that is that we are giving points for proximity to transit, for instance. So if you were to develop a project in the downtown area, you would have to meet 100% of our TDM requirements. However, you would also get base points. So it kind of balances out there a bit. And in the periphery, where maybe you do not get points for providing transit passes, and you're kind of incentivized towards reducing parking, your point requirement is a little bit lower. And I'll walk through 2 projects quickly to show how that works. And then we also wanted to provide an incentive to locate within our transit service areas, especially our BRT area. We have BRT that's going to be opening up in the community in the next in 2 years, and providing base points incentivizes location efficient development that we can serve with multimodal transportation already. This is coinciding with our TOD ordinance, which is currently running through the council process as well. So with that, we created a spreadsheet that would help a developer determine the TDM points that is required for their project and the measures that they could seek out to meet the TDM requirements. So in the very beginning, you would mention where your project is, whether it's in the transit service area, the bike share service area, the car sharing service area, where in the community it's located, and the type of project it is, including whether it's mixed use or not. If a project is mixed use, they'll need to meet TDM requirements for both uses. However, shared amenities would count towards both of those uses. And then on the second sheet, after they've inputted their project characteristics and figured out their TDM requirements, it would carry this over, and they would be able to select the measures that would be applicable to their projects. So we heard from the development community that programmatic measures are significantly more difficult to implement than infrastructure-based measures. So this is kind of like Xander was mentioning. It's easy for them to add dedicated access to bike parking because that's capital investment. They can't promise that a tenant will be willing to provide transit passes. So I've identified the types of measures that there are and given points accordingly. We understand that some of the programmatic measures are high value, so we certainly provided high value for many of those measures as well. So I wanted to walk through a couple of hypothetical projects. So this is a project in the periphery. It's a 100-unit apartment complex with 150 parking stalls. So it has 1.5 stalls per dwelling unit. And what we would do for this is if you wanted to do it manually, I wouldn't encourage this, use the spreadsheet. You'd be able to find where this project lines up on the spreadsheet, see that the base TDM requirement is 22, then multiply that based on the location and see that 14 points are required for this particular project because it's on a periphery. It would earn 50% of the points for transit, car share, and bike share because it's located outside of those service areas. And then they could select from the number of measures that we have in the program to meet the TDM requirements. That this would have to be recertified annually, as I mentioned earlier. So in this hypothetical example, they could have dedicated access to bike parking, indoor covered bike parking, bike maintenance facility, provide marketing and information materials, which we will help provide, and then unbundle parking to meet their TDM requirements. So we understand it could be controversial, lowering the value out there in the periphery, but the last thing we want is for that development to locate a mile down the road and have no TDM requirements and still generate all of the traffic and the negative externalities associated with that for our community. The second hypothetical project is a grocery store, kind of the size of a Trader Joe's, near our UW campus area. So it's 20,000 square feet. 65 parking stalls and a parking ratio of 1.3. So it's a pretty small project. So it almost doesn't need TDM, but in this particular case, it would because of the amount of parking. So they could get out of the program altogether by reducing their parking. If they didn't want to do that because the project wouldn't be viable, they would need to meet the TDM requirement. So the base TDM requirement is 9, and because this is in the general urban area, that would be reduced to 8 points. And they would be eligible for 100% of the points for transit, car share, and bike share. And on this screen, the thing I want to point out that makes it desirable to locate in this area is they would receive 3 points off the bat for locating in an all-day transit service area. And then there may be parts of their business model, such as delivery services or providing bike share memberships to their employees, or a kiosk with information about the transit arrivals that would help them meet their TDM requirements. So I mentioned that we have been working on this for a while, and since December, we have been trying to get this approved, but we have a number of loose ends that we are working on. So first of all, we don't want this just to apply to new projects. We want this to apply to existing development as redevelopment and uses turnover. So we've been looking for triggering mechanisms to bring TDM into these projects. We initially started looking at building permits. The problem there is that we could hold occupancy, which is illegal. And that was something that working through the city attorney, we found that we can't do. We were looking at site plans, but we would miss many of the use changes. So we're going to be we have a process called zoning certificates. So we're using our zoning certificate process and our site plan review to trigger TDM compliance for all developments after the 1st of next year, assuming that we are able to get the program implemented in the next month. We are modifying our ordinances, and one of the things that we've been doing through this process is actually removing a lot of the point values from the ordinance and referencing back to our plans so that we can be more nimble and respond to things that come our way, and run that through our transportation policy and planning board as modifications are needed. And one of the things that really led to a lot of these questions is white box buildings. So buildings that don't have tenants identified. It's very difficult to figure out TDM requirements if you don't know what the user is going to be and how much parking they're going to have. So we wanted that triggering mechanism for those types of developments as well, so we could generate base TDM and then refine it once tenants are identified. So we think we've resolved all of that, and we're hoping to introduce this to our policy boards and our council in the next month to 2 months for adoption. So with that, I've completed my presentation as well, and I'm open for questions should you have any. Thank you.
Thanks, Philip, and thanks again to both of you. It was super interesting to see them side by side and try and make sense of not just the similarities, but some of the differences between them. I don't know if either of you has questions for each other a little bit later, but so as I mentioned, please drop any questions that you have in the Q&A, and we'll take care of those as they come in. I wanted to start with a question. It's clear from both of your presentations that this is quite a process. It takes a while. And I know you both laid out some of the reasons why you would pursue a program like this. It really is a way to achieve these goals that you both laid out in terms of managing demand, and reaching sustainability goals and all that. As I mentioned in the beginning, though, I think some folks are more interested in just reforming land use policies, and maybe even just what's a smarter parking policy. And so there's a clear trade-off between we could just get rid of our parking requirements, or we could go down this pretty exhaustive path of implementing a much more complex system like you've both presented. So aside from those high-level goals, sustainability and travel demand, I was wondering if each of you could speak to the advantages of having a program like this in place from the city's perspective. Philip, you alluded it to a little bit in terms of developers knowing what to expect, and I think in many cases, even if you get rid of parking requirements, that's not the end of the discussion, because these projects have to go through commissions and everything. So I don't know if either of you wants to dive into that first, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I have a couple thoughts. So when designing our program, we knew that there were also other community plan updates going on in the city of LA, including our downtown community plan update, which is proposing no parking requirements in the downtown area, which makes sense. It's where our transit network is strongest. It's where there's already a huge amount of people taking sustainable modes of transportation, but keeping TDM in place for that area is a complementary policy, because if they are taking advantage of the reduced parking requirements of the community plan, good for them. They don't need to fulfill as much as far as TDM, because they're already located so strategically. So even if we eliminated parking requirements citywide, which we're not proposing to do, if anyone is wondering, the TDM policy would still be a good tool to talk about what the minimum would have been under the older policy, and therefore measuring what the impact of the building may still be on the transportation network to get better, more sustainable transportation facilities built for the people visiting and living in that building.
And to kind of build off what Xander was saying, from my experience in my conversations with developers, there were fewer developers asking for less parking and more asking for more parking. So TDM is a way that we can get a little bit of agreement with the development community on reducing the amount of parking being built. Even in the downtown area, you have developers looking to build more parking, be that to rent it out to monthly office tenants. There's the viability question that they often have. That they'll say that their development's not viable if it doesn't have parking. And this is a way to kind of demonstrate that it is possible to trade things, to have trade-offs, to incentivize multimodal transportation, still provide parking if that's what they choose to do. And if they decide that they don't want parking, then we do go the route of eliminating parking minimums, which is certainly something that's been discussed. And one of the things that we've done with our plan is actually incorporate some of the existing parking minimums into the plan, so that if parking minimums are eliminated, we can still come up with that base parking generation, because we were relying back on the parking ordinance in the past. We want to show a path that there is a way to have other forms of transportation and still have parking if it's necessary. And we think that the TDM program helps with that quite a bit.
Thanks. We've got a question here. It's pretty open-ended. I think someone would just like each of you to elaborate a little more on enforcement. How will you be ensuring compliance of things like pricing? Some of these programs, like if someone says that they're going to hand out parking, transit passes, how do you check in on how that's going? And then another part of that is what's it going to take in terms of staffing? Like, what's the program going to look like to do that?
So I can start with that one. That's been a real hot topic of conversation. So we don't have many staff allocated to this program right now. It's going to be a half a staff person when this is implemented. We know that that's going to have to grow, and hopefully the program revenues will help with that. With the annual certification check, initially it will be a lower level of effort. It'll be new buildings and those that are redeveloping, but this will grow over time. So we acknowledge that we're going to have to do more with that. On the enforcement end, we have a daily fine for non-compliance. So if someone were to come in and get a zoning certification and then within 30 days not file their TDM plan, they would begin receiving a fine daily. So that's how we're hoping to resolve that. It's certainly a challenge, but that's kind of our mechanism right now.
I don't have much to add. City of LA is similarly looking into, daily fines and those sorts of compliance. Like we have the experience of having had a TDM policy since 1993, which certainly only had a little bit. But again, the power of the covenant is only being used more so under our current update. Jonathan, I don't know if you wanted to add anything else from compliance needs.
No, I think you got it. Thanks.
Thanks. We've also got a question here about working with consultants or developers or website developers to make more interactive tools, make this a little more user-friendly. I know, Philip, you showed the spreadsheet that you're working on and already said you don't have a ton of staff capacity for the program. So I don't know if you have anything to add in that front, but Xander, I know since all across California, folks are going through a similar exercise, there's probably more opportunity for more user-friendly tools popping up. So I don't know if you wanted to speak to that at all.
I could speak a bit about that. So we have adopted VMT in 2019, and prior to we had a first iteration of a tool called the VMT calculator, which has TDM measures in it because that's what, we were complying with the law and creating our own sort of transition to VMT as the object of our analysis, because, California cities have to do so much more in terms of environmental compliance. And we did have the experience of creating a tool that was a macro-enabled Excel spreadsheet, and we've learned a lot from that. It still works, but some older versions begin to get a little buggy and mess up. So it's not a perfect process. And I think using the online tools and working with either a company, or we were lucky enough to work with a great nonprofit organization, Hack for LA, which is an affiliate arm of, I think, Code for America or Hack for America. I don't remember what the parent organization is called, but they are a stellar group of dedicated programmers that want civic tech to be as easy to use. They do user testing. So those sorts of tools are really possible. And, you know, even with our most simplified version that we've been working with, we still run into some user testing issues that we're still trying to iron out before we release. So it's still always going to be an iterative process to make it a stronger tool. But again, like web-based tools are a really great option just because they work across so many other platforms.
I guess I would add that that is the direction that we want to go eventually. We just kind of needed to get something off the ground, and the alternative was kind of just, you know, tables and having the development community look at that. So we have something, but eventually we would like to go the exact same route. So it's interesting to hear that nonprofits are able to help with some of that.
We've got a question here. I'm going to try to interpret here. Someone asked if we can, if you can imagine using TDM measures instead of requiring intersection improvements. So I think what this is getting at is the trade-off between the traditional approach to mitigation, which is if a new development is going to generate a bunch of traffic, then we need to mitigate that traffic, versus this new approach, which is we just don't want them to generate that much traffic. I don't know if either of you wants to speak to, you know, does this do away with the traditional traffic impact study, or, you know, what's the trade-off here?
Well, the movement from LOS in California, you know, there's still traffic studies. You need to do a VMT analysis now, but again, it affects projects differently. The outskirts projects where the LOS on intersections was pretty good, those now have higher VMT, and then the places that are more compact and closer to our transit network have lower VMT. So it just sort of started to switch how those developments would then therefore have to mitigate, because, you know, bigger projects could now get through without doing any mitigations, depending on the, you know, it's so context dependent, so I can't speak for everything. But in terms of intersection improvements, we don't necessarily request those, and we're moving away from that because of the understanding of how much more effective affecting the demand side is. Now, there are still certain corrections that need to be made, but we want them to be more attuned to the local environment in terms of its needs for pedestrian and bike infrastructure, not simply the infrastructure improvements like a left turn pocket or a double left turn pocket. Those are not necessarily the strategies that we've been directed to look at under the VMT policy. But it was really directed by statewide policy. I do think a TDM policy, if in place and proven, then it would be ideal to have that instead of working on the kind of things that become more expensive for DOTs to repair as far as infrastructure, especially when the cycle keeps on continuing and traffic keeps growing and we still have the same problems.
And I'd echo many of those thoughts. I mean, I think that it's not something that we've discussed in any level of detail right now, but I do think that in the future, once we can quantify the VMT savings a little bit more, and the number of trips that are reduced, then it would make sense. For the time being, I don't think that it's going to change policy just yet, but it's certainly something that we should take a look at and keep in the front of our minds as we do this.
Excellent. I think it's about to wrap up. Let me see what this last question is. Oh, this is actually a good one that we might want to tackle, if you don't mind running over a little bit. Someone asked about the impact to on-street parking, right? And I know, at least in Madison, this is something we've talked a lot about, that if you're asking developers to rein in their own on-site parking supply, there's a risk that that's going to push some of that onto the on-street parking or other nearby parking facilities.
So that is something that we've talked about, not just on-street parking, but also city-owned parking structures, because the last thing we want is for a developer to not build parking only to receive city-subsidized parking in a parking structure, especially with some of the challenges that we've had with the funding of those structures since COVID. So we are looking at our residential parking policies. That's an ongoing effort as well, limiting that to just residents to ensure that residential parking is still respected, and ensure that, for instance, if it's a commercial building, they are building the parking that they do need, not just trying to get out of TDM by forcing all of the parking out of the street. So it is something that you need to consider when you're working through this policy as well, because you don't want to incentivize bad behavior like that. So I think that the number one thing that my takeaway from the TDM process is that everything is very interrelated, and you dive into this, and it kind of there are a number of different tangents and different directions you're going to need to go in, and be responsive to those things. And it impacts so many people. This is really impacting every citizen in the city and every developer. So it's a lot of work, but the payoff could be huge.
Yeah. Xander, did you have a similar experience you wanted to speak to at all, or?
Yeah, I will say that our TDM policy is not going to add new means of reducing your parking. It is the parking requirements of the local community plan still apply. The reductions that you can take from our transit-oriented communities policy still apply. So there's nothing that new. And I will say that we did have a great research paper done on developers taking advantage of our parking reductions. And the truth is that we have all these different incentive programs, and reducing parking below or greatly below the parking requirements as allowed by certain incentive programs is still just not as highly taken advantage of. We do have some new projects in the pipeline that are zero parking, and some affordable, 100% affordable developments have thankfully taken advantage of that, because that would help them save money and provide more units quickly. So it is. We still need to do some more research on that, but again, we're not seeing the parking spillover effect that we would initially predict is the sort of idea. But that's also partly because we're just not seeing that many people reduce their parking that much.
I think that's a great point. That it probably the fears about those spillover, the spillover parking is probably greater than what we'd actually see on the ground. But either way, just going through this process, where I think, like you said, Philip, forces us to think about the system as a whole rather than just each site operating on its own in a vacuum. So I think maybe that's one of a great final takeaway about where going through an effort like this can take you in thinking about the city's transportation system and how it interacts with the local land uses. So with that, I think we'll wrap up. Thanks again to both of you for joining us today, and it's exciting to see all the progress, and hopefully this stuff will be hitting the ground soon, and we can see more cities learn from your experiences. So thanks everyone for joining us today. Again, if you want to stay up to date on webinars and local and other news, visit our website, ssti.us, sign up for the newsletter, and folks can reach out to me at any time if they want. My email address is dropped in the chat. Thanks again.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.